Let's talk about namespaces now. Namespaces allow you to create virtual clusters within the same physical cluster. Namespaces logically separate your cluster. The standard namespace is called default, and that's where the resources are launched in by default. So whenever we were not specifying a namespace, we were actually launching pods, deployments, and so on in the default namespace. There is also a namespace for Kubernetes-specific resources called kubesystem. For instance, our monitoring was launched in kubesystem. The DNS add-on also is in kubesystem. The dashboard is also an example of something that lives in the kubesystem namespace. Namespaces are intended when you have multiple teams or multiple projects using the Kubernetes cluster. You don't need this if you're the only user. The name of the resources need to be unique within a namespace, but not across namespaces. For instance, you can have the deployment hello world multiple times in different namespaces, but not twice in one namespace. You can divide resources of a Kubernetes cluster using namespaces. You can limit the resources on a per namespace basis. So this is what I just explained in the previous lecture. These are the quotas that you can put, and you typically put them per namespace. For instance, the marketing team can only use a maximum of 10 GB of memory, 2 load balancers, and 2 CPU cores. These are quotas that you can easily put in your Kubernetes cluster. First, you need to create a new namespace. You can easily do that using kubectl create namespace myspace. If you want to list the namespaces, you can do kubectl get namespaces. This now shows the default namespace, the kubesystem namespace, and the newly created myspace. If you want to set that namespace as a default, so that when you launch new resources, then those will not be launched in default, but in myspace, you can use those two lines. First, you need to get the context with this command. Then you can change the context and you can specify that you want the namespace myspace used in the config. You can then create resource limits within that namespace. Here we have an object of kind resource quota. We have the metadata, we give the name. Here we also have a namespace. We specify our newly created namespace myspace. And then we have the specifications. We have a hard limit on request CPU, request memory, limit CPU, and limit memory. The request CPU is 1 core, 1 GB of memory. There's a limit on 2 cores and 2 GB of memory. Here is an example where we specify limits on objects. So we can say, in this namespace, myspace, you can only have 10 config maps, 4 persistent volume claims, 20 replication controllers, 10 secrets, 10 services, and only 2 load balancers. Those load balancers can be interesting because on AWS they cost money for every load balancer that you have. So these are things that you typically want to restrict. In the next demo, I will show you how this works.